Imagine you are standing in a field in France. The year is 1919. The war ended 8 months ago. And you are back on the ground that, not long before, was the most dangerous place on earth. You can still see it. The shape of the trenches in the mud. The craters where shells came down so often that the earth gave up trying to be flat. The barbed wire is still there in places, rusting now. There are things in the soil that will not stop being dangerous for another 100 years. But it is quiet. That is the thing that strikes you. After 4 years of noise so constant and so enormous that men went deaf, went mad, stopped being able to hear their own thoughts. It is quiet. 9 million soldiers are dead. Somewhere between 12 and 20 million people in total, when you count the civilians, the famines, the disease that followed the armies home. 21 million more are wounded. And wounded, in the language of the First World War, means things that the word does not fully carry. Missing limbs, burned lungs from gas that will never fully heal. Minds shattered into shapes that medicine of 1919 had no framework to repair. They called it shell shock, this new thing the war made. Men who flinched at doors closing. Men who could not sleep without the trenches coming back. Men who had survived everything the war threw at them and came home and found that the war had not, in any meaningful sense, let them go. A generation of fathers did not come home. A generation of children grew up knowing their father only as a photograph on the mantelpiece and a name their mother said carefully, in a tone that meant, do not ask too many questions. And now, in the field, in the quiet, the people left standing had to figure out what to do next. Think about what that actually means. A world that had just spent 4 years building the most efficient machinery for killing human beings ever devised, and now had to decide what to do with all of that. With all of those people, with all of that grief. Wars are supposed to end with something. A victor, a clear accounting, a sense that the terrible price paid brought something definite. This war did not feel like that. It felt like an enormous, catastrophic fire that had finally run out of things to burn. Not won, not lost exactly, depending on which side you're standing on. Just stopped. Exhausted. The parties separating at the armistice the way two fighters separate at a bell. Neither of them finished. Both of them bleeding. Both of them planning what they would do differently next time. The peace treaty that followed was supposed to prevent the next time. It did not prevent the next time. It may have made the next time almost inevitable. And the story of how an instrument of peace became a machine for manufacturing resentment is where this whole thing begins. January 1919. Paris. Representatives of nearly 30 nations have gathered to decide what the world looks like now. The defeated powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, were not invited to the table. Hold that detail in your mind for a moment, because it matters. The people who had to live with the terms of this peace were not permitted to negotiate those terms. They would be told what had been decided and asked to sign. the big decisions were made by four men: Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Four men in rooms for months, arguing about a world none of them fully understood, trying to satisfy domestic publics that had paid an enormous price and wanted someone to pay them back for it. Clemenceau wanted Germany broken. France had lost over 1 million soldiers and had much of its industrial heartland turned into a wasteland. The war had been fought largely on French soil. Clemenceau had lived through the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, when Germany had already humiliated France once. He was not interested in mercy. He was interested in making sure it never happened again. Wilson wanted something else. He had brought to Paris a document called the 14 Points, a framework for a peace based on national self-determination, open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and a new international body that would resolve future disputes without war. He believed, with the certainty of a man whose beliefs had not yet been tested, that this was the moment humanity could choose a different way. The treaty they produced was a compromise of men who disagreed with almost everything, which meant it satisfied no one. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 28th of June 1919 in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. The location was chosen deliberately. In 1871, after France's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, the Germans had proclaimed their empire in that same hall. The French had not forgotten. The signing of the peace in the Hall of Mirrors was a message, wrapped in a treaty, telling Germany they had not been forgiven, and the terms were severe. Germany lost 13% of its territory, including regions with large German populations handed to newly created states. It lost all of its overseas colonies. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. Its navy was reduced to a coastal defense force. The Rhineland, the whole strip of German territory along the French border, the buffer between the two countries, was to be stripped of German troops and fortifications and occupied by Allied forces. The German government was presented with a bill of reparations, initially left blank when the Germany signed, which German politicians described bitterly as signing a blank check. Eventually set at $33 billion. The economist John Maynard Keynes had been at that conference, working for the British Treasury. He resigned in disgust before it was over, went home and wrote a book saying the treaty was a catastrophe, that the reparations were beyond anything Germany could pay, and that a peace designed to crush a country rather than rebuild it would not hold. He called it a Carthaginian peace. He said it was abhorrent and detestable. And then there was Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. Germany, under Article 231, was required to accept complete responsibility for causing the war. Not shared responsibility, not partial responsibility, complete responsibility. The aggression, the damage, all of it Germany's fault, Germany's burden, Germany's signature at the bottom of the page. The Germans had a word for what this felt like. Diktat, a dictated peace, not negotiated, not arrived at between equals, imposed. When the German delegation was handed the terms, their foreign minister refused to stand up to receive them. Now, the treaty was not, by the historical standards of what victorious powers do to defeated ones, uniquely savage. With a peace Germany itself had imposed on Russia in 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had been far harsher. Clemenceau, who was called soft by his own domestic critics, had wanted worse. French Marshal Foch, when he read the final terms, said it was not a peace, but a 20-year armistice. He was right, and he meant it as a criticism, that the treaty was too lenient. So the problem was not only what the treaty said, the problem was what it felt like. To ordinary Germans, not to the generals, not to the politicians, but to the man on the street in Berlin, or Munich, or a small town in Bavaria, who had sent his son to fight and received a folded letter in return. The treaty did not feel like a reckoning. It felt like a theft. Germany had not been invaded. German armies were still on foreign soil when the armistice was signed. The home front had been told, until very near the end, that the war was going well. So when the terms came back, and the politicians who signed the armistice, the civilian politicians of the new democratic government, were blamed for the defeat, the ground was already prepared for a particular and very dangerous story. The story that Germany had not actually lost. That Germany had been stabbed in the back by the civilians, by the socialists, by the Jews. It was a lie. A lie that met a wound so deep and so unhealed that millions of people chose it over the truth, because the truth was too painful and the lie gave them someone to put the pain. That lie had a name in German, the Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back myth. And a decade later, a man in Munich would build a political career on it. Germany came out of the war as something it had never been before. Democracy. The Kaiser had abdicated. The empire was gone. In its place, hammered together in the chaos of defeat, was the Weimar Republic, named for the city where the Constitution was drafted, because Berlin was too dangerous, too full of revolution and counter-revolution and armed men from several factions, all convinced they knew what Germany should become. The Weimar Republic was born into the worst possible circumstances. Its founding politicians signed the armistice and were blamed for the defeat. They accepted the Treaty of Versailles and were blamed for the humiliation. They inherited a country exhausted, traumatized, economically crippled, and politically divided between people who thought the Weimar Republic was too conservative and people who thought it was dangerously radical. It had almost no supporters who loved it for what it was. It had supporters on the left who tolerated it as better than the alternative, and supporters on the right who tolerated it while working to replace it with something stronger. And it had enemies on both extremes who wanted it gone entirely. What it needed, desperately, was time and stability. What it got was the opposite. In 1923, France and Belgium occupied the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland, because Germany had fallen behind on its reparation payments. The German government responded by funding a general strike, printing money to pay the striking workers. The result was one of the most dramatic economic collapses in modern history. By the autumn of 1923, the German mark was worth less than the paper it was printed on. A loaf of bread that had cost a few marks at the start of the year cost 200 billion marks by November. Workers were being paid twice a day so they could spend their wages before the value dropped further. People with savings, the teachers, the clerks, the small business owners, the pensioners who had worked their whole lives and put the money in the bank, watched everything they had earned disappear. Not slowly, overnight. By November, $1 American was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. A wheelbarrow full of banknotes could not buy a newspaper. People burned their paper money for heat because it was cheaper than firewood. This is not a metaphor. This actually happened. The hyperinflation was eventually brought under control. A new currency was introduced. The economy stabilized. By the mid-1920s, Germany was actually recovering. A period so unexpectedly prosperous, it was called the Golden Twenties. American loans flooded in. Berlin became one of the most culturally vibrant cities in the world. But the damage was done in a way that prosperity could not undo. The people who had lost everything in 1923 did not get their savings back when the economy improved. The middle class, the shopkeepers, the civil servants, the families who had worked and saved and believed that responsible behaviour was rewarded, had learned a lesson about the Weimar Republic that they would not forget. That it could not protect them. That when the crisis came, the system failed, and ordinary people paid the price. That memory did not fade during the good years. It waited. On the 29th of October 1929, Black Tuesday, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. This is not a story about America, but the Wall Street crash matters because of what it did to Germany specifically. The American loans that had been propping up the German economy were called in almost immediately. The banks that had been funding Germany's recovery pulled the money out. The fragile prosperity of the Golden Twenties evaporated, and what it left behind looked horribly familiar. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed. In a country of 66 million people, that number touched almost every family. Men who had fought in the trenches were selling pencils on street corners. Women who had managed through the hyperinflation were now managing through something worse. Not the chaos of money becoming worthless, but the grinding, dignityless misery of there being no money at all. The Weimar Republic had never been loved. Now it was also visibly failing. And into that failure, from a beer hall in Munich, came a voice. Adolf Hitler had been telling the same story since the early 1920s. Germany was not defeated. Germany was betrayed. The humiliation of Versailles was not justice but robbery. The poverty and the unemployment and the chaos were not the consequences of a lost war and bad economics. They were a conspiracy, a deliberate attack by the enemies inside Germany's borders. Enemies who wore German clothes and spoke German words, but were not, in a twisted logic of the story, truly German at all. It was a lie that arrived at precisely the moment when millions of people were desperate enough to believe it. In 1928, the Nazi Party received 2.6% of the German vote. 2 years later, after the Depression had taken hold, they received 18%. 2 years after that, they were the largest party in the Reichstag. The Weimar Republic had given people a vote. Hitler used that vote to dismantle it. This did not happen because the German people were uniquely evil or uniquely susceptible to deception. It happened because 10 years of humiliation, economic catastrophe, and institutional failure had produced a population that had stopped trusting the institutions designed to protect them, and had started looking for someone who promised, loudly and simply, and with absolute certainty, to fix it. Desperate people make different calculations than comfortable ones. This is not an excuse. It is a fact. And it is one of the most important facts in this story. Because if we tell ourselves that what happened in Germany could only have happened in Germany, we have missed the point entirely. By the time Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January of 1933, the rest of Europe had been watching for over a decade. They had watched the rise of Mussolini in Italy. They had watched the instability of the Weimar Republic. They had watched, with varying degrees of attention and concern, the emergence of this loud, strange, violent political movement that was saying alarming things about Jews and race and the need for German living space in the East. And largely, they had decided not to act. This is one of the hardest points of his story to understand from where we stand now, knowing how it ends. How did they not see it? How did the leaders of Britain and France watch Hitler take power? Watch him rearm Germany in open violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Watch him march troops into the Rhineland of 1936. A move that violated the treaty, and that Hitler himself later admitted he would have immediately reversed if France had pushed back militarily. And do nothing. The answer has several layers. The first is exhaustion. The men making the decisions in 1933 had lived through the First World War. Many of them had fought in it. They had seen what a European war cost, and they were not willing to pay that price again lightly. The memory of those 9 million dead soldiers was not abstract to them. It was in the mud on their boots, in the names of men they had known personally, in the shape of their own nightmares. Peace was not a policy preference for these men. It was a desperate, bone-deep need. The second is miscalculation. Hitler was strange, loud, and clearly unpleasant. But the leaders of France and Britain had seen loud, unpleasant men before. They believed, or convinced themselves they believed, that he could be managed, appeased, given something small to satisfy the crowd behind him, and then brought into the respectable world of European diplomacy, where the rules were understood. The third is that some of them agreed with him. Not about everything. Not about the violence necessarily. But there was a thread of opinion in the British establishment, and in parts of the French one, that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh. That Germany had legitimate grievances. That Hitler, for all his theatre, was correcting a genuine injustice. They were wrong about that, and the wrongness cost more than almost any mistake in the history of the world. Let me bring you back to that field in France. It is not 1919 anymore. 20 years have passed. The trenches have softened in the rain, and the grass has grown back over them all. The villages that were shelled to rubble have been rebuilt, stone by stone, by people who remembered what they looked like. The children who grew up without fathers were adults now, with children of their own. The memorials are everywhere. Every village, every town, every city in France and Britain has a wall with names on it. In France alone, there are around 35,000 war memorials. Almost every commune in the country built one. You cannot walk through a French town without encountering the names of men from that town who did not come back. The scale of it is just staggering. The names are so many that the memorials had to develop a new aesthetic language just to contain them all. Long panels of stone, column after column of identical typeface, because there was no other way to fit everyone in. This is what the First World War left behind. Not victory, not defeat, but 35,000 walls with names on them, and a generation of people who had paid everything and come away with a world that did not feel worth what it had cost. In Germany, the resentment had been building for 20 years. The war guilt clause, the reparations, the hyperinflation, the depression. Each one had added weight to a thing that was already too heavy. A man had risen to power on the promise of lifting that weight and replacing it with something the people in the beer halls and the unemployment queues and the stripped out savings accounts could believe in. He was rearming. He was taking land. He was saying, out loud, that the old boundaries were about to change. In France and Britain, the men in charge were hoping he would just stop. But he would not stop. In September 1939, he would not stop in Poland. And that is where we are going next. The trenches, the losses, the treaty, the republic that could not hold, the crash, the rise, all of it has been pulling towards a single moment for 20 years. A morning in early September, when German tanks crossed the border and the world discovered that the war that was supposed to end all wars had only been the first one. Next time, we're going to talk about the men who came after. How one by one, across the 1920s and 1930s, the democracies of Europe handed themselves over, in Italy, in Germany, in Spain, to men who had decided that the old ways were finished and that what the world needed now was someone willing to use force without hesitation. How it happened from the inside. What it felt like when the door closed. Sleep well. This has been The Sleepy Soldier. If you fell asleep before the end, you were listening the right way. Good night.